In the heart of medieval Europe, where cobblestone squares echoed with the screams of the condemned, there stood an instrument of execution so horrifying that even seasoned torturers would cross themselves before approaching it. The breaking wheel, a massive wooden disc mounted horizontally on a tall post, was not designed merely to kill, but to transform the human body into a grotesque sculpture of agony that could take days to complete its ghastly work. Picture, if you will, the morning mist rising from a German town square in 1540. The wheel looms against the grey winter sky, like some medieval monument to suffering, its heavy oak spokes casting twisted shadows across frost-covered stones. Soon those spokes would cradle a broken man whose journey from respected merchant to public enemy had sealed his fate in the most brutal manner imaginable. This was no crude instrument amid barbarian justice, but rather the refined pinnacle of medieval judicial power, a technology of terror that transformed public executions into elaborate theaters of state authority. Across the Holy Roman Empire, from the Germanic territories to the courts of France, the wheel represented the absolute dominion of monarchs and magistrates over the bodies and souls of their subjects. Its very presence in a town square served as a constant reminder that royal justice, once provoked, could reduce any man to a collection of shattered bones and labored breaths. The wheel's reign of terror stretched across centuries, claiming thousands of victims whose crimes ranged from murder and treason to mere theft when committed by repeat offenders. Yet among all those who met their end upon its merciless embrace, few stories illustrate the medieval mind's capacity for calculated cruelty, quite like that of Johann Kohlhaas, a man whose quest for justice became an obsession that would ultimately destroy him in the most public and agonizing manner possible. But this tale begins not with broken bones and dying gasps, but with pride, the fatal flaw that transformed a successful merchant into an outlaw, a victim of injustice into a perpetrator of rebellion, and ultimately a living man into a twisted monument to the limits of human endurance. Today, we follow one man's inexorable march toward that wheel of torment, a journey that began with stolen horses and wounded dignity, escalated through years of legal battles and violent revenge, and concluded with bones snapping like kindling, while an entire city watched in horrified fascination. Johann Kohlhaas was born around 1500 into the emerging merchant class of Brandenburg, that ambitious stratum of society, balanced precariously between peasant origins and noble aspirations. Unlike the feudal aristocrats who inherited their wealth through bloodline, or the serfs who accepted poverty as God's will, merchants like Kohlhaas had to claw their way to prosperity through cunning, determination, and an almost fanatical dedication to their trade. By his 30s, Kohlhaas had built a thriving horse trading business that stretched across the dangerous roads between Berlin and Leipzig. His caravans carried not just livestock, but luxury goods, silver and correspondence for nobles who appreciated his reliability in an age where highway bandits and corrupt officials made commerce a perpetual gamble. Contemporary records show he owned substantial property in Cologne, employed dozens of workers, and commanded the respect of his fellow merchants, who often sought his counsel in business disputes. Yet success bred in Kohlhaas something far more dangerous than arrogance, an inflexible belief in justice that bordered on the pathological. Where other merchants accepted occasional losses as the cost of doing business in a corrupt world, Kohlhaas possessed an almost childlike faith that right would ultimately triumph over might. This moral rigidity, which might have made him an admirable figure in a more just age, would prove catastrophically unsuited to the realities of 16th-century power politics. The fatal flaw revealed itself fully in 1532, when Saxon nobles unlawfully confiscated two of his finest horses at Herzberg Castle, refusing either payment or return, despite clear legal documentation of ownership. For most merchants, this would have been an expensive but forgettable lesson in aristocratic privilege. For Kohlhaas, it became a wound to his sense of cosmic justice that would fester for years, eventually consuming his fortune, his family, and ultimately his life. What made Koolhaze particularly dangerous was the combination of his merchant's intelligence with his absolute moral certainty. He possessed the education to navigate legal systems, the wealth to fund prolonged campaigns, and the connections to recruit followers who shared his grievances against noble corruption. Contemporary letters reveal a man who genuinely believed God had chosen him as an instrument of divine justice, transforming personal injury into sacred mission. As legal appeals failed and years passed without satisfaction, Koolhaze's correspondence grew increasingly apocalyptic in tone. He began signing letters as a man unjustly oppressed by the world, and later, more ominously, as God's appointed avenger against the wicked. This evolution from victim to vigilante would prove irreversible. By 1540, the respected merchant had become something far more dangerous. An intelligent, well-funded fanatic, convinced that violence in service of justice was not just permissible, but divinely mandated. This transformation sealed his appointment with the wheel. The spark that ignited Koolhaze's final conflagration came in March 1540, with an act of calculated brutality that crossed every line of medieval authority. The systematic burning of Wittstock, a Saxon town that had become, in his twisted logic, complicit in his victimization through its failure to support his legal claims. This was no spontaneous outburst of rage, but a meticulously planned military operation that revealed the terrifying extent of Koolhaze's transformation. Leading a force of 60 armed followers, peasants, discharged soldiers, and fellow victims of noble oppression, he struck Wittstock at dawn, when its defenses were minimal and its inhabitants defenseless. The attack targeted not just property, but the very foundations of Saxon authority, with Koolhaze's men systematically torching the homes of town officials, while herding civilians into the central square. Contemporary chronicles describe the methodical nature of the destruction. Granaries set ablaze to starve the region into submission, the town hall reduced to smoking ruins to eliminate administrative records, and the church desecrated as a symbol of the corrupt alliance between secular and religious power. Most shocking to medieval sensibilities, Koolhaze forced the captured town magistrates to publicly confess their complicity in his mistreatment before releasing them to carry word of his actions to their Saxon overlords. The burning of Wittstock represented more than simple banditry or even personal revenge. It was an act of organized rebellion that struck at the heart of imperial authority. Koolhaze's written proclamation, distributed throughout the region, declared himself God's appointed minister of justice against the wicked, transforming his private grievance into a public challenge to the entire feudal order. Emperor Charles V's response was swift and decisive. Within weeks of receiving reports of the attack, he issued an imperial proclamation declaring Koolhaze an enemy of the realm and authorizing his capture by any means necessary. The bounty placed on his head was substantial, but more ominously, the emperor specifically ordered that Koolhaze be taken alive for public execution, a clear signal that his death would serve as a spectacular warning to others who might dare challenge imperial prerogatives. The trap was set through treachery rather than military might. In late 1540, Saxon officials approached Koolhaze under a flag of truce, offering safe conduct for negotiations to end his rebellion. Desperate to legitimize his cause, and perhaps still clinging to his faith in justice, Koolhaze accepted. The moment he entered Saxon territory, he was seized by waiting soldiers who had no intention of honoring their word. The systematic destruction of Johann Koolhaze began not with the wheel's first crushing blow, but with the calculated psychological torture that preceded his execution by weeks. Medieval justice understood that breaking a man's spirit was often more effective than breaking his body, and the authorities spared no effort in ensuring that Koolhaze's final weeks would be a masterclass in despair. Confined in the deepest dungeon beneath Berlin's City Hall, Koolhaze found himself in a stone cell barely large enough for a man to lie flat, with only a narrow slit near the ceiling allowing the faintest trace of daylight. The walls wept with moisture, that turned his straw bedding into a rotting mass, that harbored rats and worse vermin. But the true torture was auditory. Positioned directly above his cell, carpenters worked daily constructing his execution apparatus, their hammering and sawing serving as a constant reminder of his approaching fate. The psychological assault intensified through carefully orchestrated visits from religious authorities who claimed to offer spiritual comfort while actually deepening his torment. These clerics, well versed in the wheel's operation, provided vivid descriptions of how his limbs would be methodically shattered, how his breathing would become increasingly labored as his ribs were crushed into his lungs, and how death might take days to finally claim him. They spoke of other victims who had lingered for 3 days, their broken bodies twisted into impossible configurations, while crowds gathered to witness their prolonged agony. Food became another instrument of torture, provided in quantities sufficient to keep him alive, but inadequate to maintain his strength. Guards reported that within 2 weeks the once robust merchant appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, his hands developing a persistent tremor that worsened when he heard the construction sounds overhead. His sleep, when it came, was punctuated by nightmares, so violent that other prisoners could hear his screams echoing through the dungeon corridors. On the morning of January 22, 1540, the final phase began with Colhez's removal from his cell for the ritualistic procession to his execution. Stripped of his merchant's fine clothing and dressed in rough sackcloth that marked him as condemned, he was forced to walk barefoot through Berlin's frozen streets, while citizens lined the route to shower him with refuse and curses. Contemporary accounts describe his visible deterioration. The man who had once commanded respect as a successful trader now appeared broken in spirit, if not yet in body. The procession followed a carefully planned route designed to maximize his humiliation by passing every location significant to his former life. They led him past his old business premises, now shuttered and abandoned, where signs posted by city authorities warned against association with traitors. They paused before the homes of former associates who had publicly disavowed any connection to him, forcing him to witness how completely his rebellion had isolated him from respectable society. Most cruelly, the route passed the church, where he had once worshipped as a respected citizen, its doors now barred to him as an excommunicate. At the execution ground outside the city walls, the wheel awaited, a massive oak disc nearly 8 feet in diameter, mounted horizontally atop a thick wooden post that elevated it above the crowd for maximum visibility. Its surface had been fitted with leather restraints, and the spaces between its spokes lined with wooden blocks that would serve as anvils for the executioner's hammer. The wheel itself bore the stains of previous victims, dark patches that no amount of weather had been able to wash clean. The formal reading of his sentence took nearly an hour, with city officials detailing every crime and justifying the severity of his punishment before hundreds of spectators who had traveled from surrounding villages to witness the spectacle. When finally stripped completely naked and bound, spread-eagle to the wheel's outer rim, Colhez's body already showed the effects of his imprisonment, his ribs clearly visible beneath pale skin, his muscles wasted from weeks of minimal nutrition. The executioner, a professional who took pride in his craft, began with a ceremonial examination of his tools while explaining to the crowd the precise technique required to ensure maximum suffering without premature death. The psychological torture that had lasted weeks was finally giving way to physical destruction. But the wheel's terrible work was only beginning. The executioner raised his iron-headed hammer with the measured precision of a craftsman, positioning Colhez's left forearm across the wheel's edge, between 2 spokes. The first blow descended with a sound witnesses later described as resembling a thick branch snapping in winter frost, a sharp crack followed by Colhez's scream, muffled by the leather bit clenched between his teeth, but still audible throughout the crowd. Medical understanding of the era was primitive, but the executioner possessed an intuitive knowledge of human anatomy that made his work devastatingly effective. Each subsequent blow was calculated to shatter bone while avoiding immediately fatal damage to major arteries or organs. Kohlhaas's right arm followed, then his shoulders, each impact sending shockwaves through his nervous system that caused his entire body to convulse against the restraints. By the third hour, his legs had received the same methodical treatment, reducing what had once been a functioning human frame into a collection of broken appendages, twisted at impossible angles. The wheel's design ensured that gravity worked against him. His shattered limbs, no longer supported by intact bone structure, began to droop through the gaps between spokes, stretching torn muscles and ligaments with each labored breath. The systematic breaking of his ribs proved most agonizing of all. The executioner cracked them carefully, leaving enough structural integrity to prevent immediate collapse of his chest cavity, while ensuring that each breath became an exercise in agony. Pink foam began bubbling from Kohlhaas's mouth as blood from punctured lung tissue mixed with saliva, creating the distinctive death rattle that would continue for hours. As evening approached and most spectators departed, Kohlhaas entered the prolonged dying phase that made the wheel uniquely horrifying among execution methods. His breathing became increasingly irregular, long periods of silence followed by desperate rattling gasps as his body fought for life despite its catastrophic injuries. Throughout the cold January night, guards reported hearing his progressively weaker moans and the wet sucking sound of air passing through blood-filled airways. Death finally claimed him near dawn on January 24th, after 38 hours of unimaginable suffering. His final breath came as a long, slow exhalation that seemed to deflate his broken body completely, leaving only a twisted monument to medieval justice's absolute power over human flesh. Johann Kohlhaas's spectacular execution achieved its intended purpose with chilling effectiveness. Merchant uprisings virtually disappeared from German territories for the remainder of the 16th century. His broken body, left on display until spring weather finally separated bone from rotting flesh, served as a constant reminder of what awaited those who dared challenge imperial authority with violence. Yet history's judgment proved more complex than his executioners anticipated. Within decades of his death, legal scholars began citing Kohlhaas's case as evidence of the arbitrary noble power that had driven him to rebellion. His original complaint about stolen horses, while handled through inexcusable extremism, highlighted genuine flaws in medieval commercial law that later reformers would address through legal rather than violent means. The wheel that claimed Kohlhaas's life offers a brutal lesson about the seductive danger of vigilante justice. His transformation from legitimate victim to violent criminal demonstrates how personal grievances, however justified, can escalate beyond all moral bounds when individuals appoint themselves agents of divine retribution. Modern audiences, witnessing contemporary struggles between individual rights and state power, might recognize uncomfortable parallels in Kohlhaas's story. The wheel may be gone, but the human capacity for both oppression and resistance remains unchanged, making his tale as relevant today as it was in that blood-soaked Berlin Square 5 centuries ago.